Hey guys, welcome back. So a couple days ago, one of 343's art directors released a ton of Halo 5 concept art focusing on Forerunner weapons, vehicles, and enemies. And there's some pretty damn interesting things in this concept art drop. One of them being the War Sphinxes. So in this video, I'm going to be sort of theorizing about the possible impact that these concepts would have had on Halo 5, and the impact that some of them may still have on the future of Halo and Halo 6's story. War Sphinxes, I'm looking at you, baby. Okay, so first up, we have what I'm going to be calling a Forerunner tank. Now, the word Forerunner tank might seem quite familiar to you. If it does, and you're not sure why, let me tell you. Originally in Halo 2, there was going to be a mission called Forerunner Tank, where you drove a Forerunner tank. It was going to be set after Regret, when Chief jumps in the water after killing Regret, and before the Gravemind. And basically, you were going to go through these sort of dark caves under the water in an actual Forerunner tank, killing things whilst you've got these Gravemind tentacles slamming down next to you and chasing you. And basically, you go through these tunnels until you eventually meet the Gravemind. This was, as we all know, eventually cut from Halo 2. However, with the addition of Forerunner vehicles, or a Forerunner vehicle I should say, the Phaeton in Halo 5, it did always get me thinking why the Forerunner tank was never added. And I guess this kind of explains that. It was obviously conceptualized and drawing boarded, but unfortunately it obviously never got past the drawing board. Hopefully in Halo 6 it will do, because I really need some more Forerunner vehicles. Next up, we have three things that are sort of interlinked. The first of these is the Forerunner cannon pod. Now, from the looks of it, the cannon pod looks a lot like a prototype Phaeton. It looks like a Forerunner-styled VTOL, which is exactly what the Phaeton is, so I'm guessing that the Phaeton started out as a cannon pod and then evolved into becoming the Phaeton. Then we have two quite odd vehicles, in fact. First of all, we have the Forerunner Boomerang Tank Carrier. Now, what this looks like is a sort of large tank where you can dock multiple cannon pods into, and then you can get out of the cannon pod and control this sort of airship carrier. I don't really know what the purpose of this would have been. Maybe to allow these cannon pods to travel through slipspace. You dock them into the boomerang and then go on the boomerang and control the boomerang through slipspace. That's all I can really imagine it being used for. And then we also have the Forerunner socket tank, which is seemingly pretty much the same thing as the boomerang tank carrier, but it's a lot smaller and only holds one cannon pod instead of the boomerang's three. Now, given that this is called the socket tank, not the socket tank carrier, we could pretty much assume that this would maybe buff the cannon pod stats, so maybe make it faster and a lot stronger, given that it's called a tank and it is clearly distinguished from the tank carrier. These kind of give me a sort of booster frame feel, like you attach things into them and then it gives the thing that you're attaching an upgrade. In the case of booster frames, it's the Spartans getting the upgrade, and in the case of this, it's the cannon pods getting the upgrade by fitting into the socket tank or fitting into the boomerang. Overall, very interesting stuff. Not entirely sure what the usefulness of these two things would have been. The cannon pod was clearly an early Phaeton, but the boomerang and socket tank, not too sure how useful they would have been. Cool, definitely. Useful, not so much. The next piece of concept art is arguably the piece de la resistance of this entire concept art drop. It is the thing that has me the most intrigued and interested to find out what its original purpose was meant to be in Halo 5's story. This thing is a War Sphinx. So for those who aren't too sure what War Sphinxes are, they were Forerunner fighting suits that were used during the Human Forerunner War back in like 100,000 BCE, and basically what they were a Forerunner version of the Mantis, think of it like that, where a warrior servant could get inside them and control them like a mech, much like the Mantis. However, they could also move around and control themselves. But this isn't what intrigues me about them being cut from Halo 5. What intrigues me about that is what they were actually used for and their purpose in Halo Cryptum, which is the first book in the Forerunner trilogy. In this book, they were used to guard the Didact whilst he was dormant in the Cryptum, and when the Cryptum was disturbed and the Didact was awoken, these War Sphinxes started walking around and healing him and trying to bring him back to life, basically. And that is definitely intriguing for story possibilities for Halo 5 and for the future as well. So I do have a little theory about what the War Sphinxes could have been doing in Halo 5 had they not been cut, and how that would have impacted the story. So rewind back to the very end of the Forerunner trilogy, and the Halo array has been fired. There's like very few Forerunners left in the galaxy. Bornsteller is one of the last ones left, and he has pretty much nothing to do for a very long time. So he puts himself into a cryptum so he can stay dormant and wait out the time until either he wakes up intentionally or somebody else needs him and comes to wake him up from his cryptum. How do War Sphinxes play into this? Well, like I said before, War Sphinxes guarded the Didact's cryptum when he was asleep in this dormant slumber. They would do the exact same thing, possibly, if this theory was correct, for Bornsteller. How does this link to Halo 5? Well, we had that Halo 5 E3 2013 trailer where Chief was walking on that sandy planet that slightly resembled the Ark, although I do not think that it was the Ark at all, because the Ark would not look almost that perfect. It would look incredibly destroyed and war-torn, but that's another story for a different day. So in that trailer, when Chief is walking through the desert and he wakes that Guardian up and it rises out the sand and begins to sing, that Guardian may have been one of the first protectors of Bornsteller's cryptum. Very far-fetched, incredibly out there, I know, but I'm just trying to piece together what things that we have left that are still unanswered and try and fit them around this concept art. Next up, we have the Forerunner Packmaster. Now, to me, this looks quite a lot like a Forerunner werewolf. It's just the way that it's almost howling in that picture there, and its general stance just looks like a werewolf. The original intention for this, I can assume, given the name Packmaster, is that it is probably a leader of a pack of crawlers, and it would function much like an elite. With the elites, you have an elite that controls a squad of grunts. With the Promethians, you'd probably have a Packmaster that controlled a pack of crawlers. Now, I can imagine that this was eventually swapped out for the soldiers, as their role does seem kind of similar. However, one very interesting thing to notice about this is that it actually got past the concept art stage and into the very early stages of actual modeling and design. You can see this picture here of it in a 3D designing software, where there's a very low poly model of it, but nonetheless there's a model, so it obviously got quite far into development, at least much further than the rest of the stuff in this video. Due to this, we could see this again in the future, and to be honest, I kind of hope we do, because this design looks really, really cool. It looks menacing, and it just looks badass in general. Next up, we have the Forerunner Cavalier, which is known as a Forerunner mimic. Now, we can see from this concept art here that he has a sort of metal case, but at least in this concept art, he has no body, he has nothing underneath the case. Maybe that means that, for example, he could mimic other enemies, so he could mimic an elite and could work as sort of an elite under a metal case like the soldiers have. But this obviously looks like pretty early concepts, pretty prototype concepts for it. As we see moving into the other concept art, it sort of developed a body underneath the armor. As we can see in this picture here, it had two different types of face, which leads me to believe that this would have been more than just a typical enemy, because it has an attack face and a conversational face. So it wasn't just going to be fighting us 24/7 like the soldiers or knights, it was obviously meant to be talking to us in some way. We then move on to these two pieces of concept art here, which show it as having a staff and having certain abilities such as a shield and a shockwave. Now, this is pretty important in theorizing about what its original purpose could have been. Because of the staff and its general abilities, to me, it kind of reminds me of an honor guard, maybe. An honor guard for a significant Forerunner character, possibly the Warden, or maybe, if my completely out there theory was correct, Bornsteller. Now, another very interesting thing about the concept art for the Cavalier is in this Cavalier Redux design, which is sort of a redesign of the Cavalier that they obviously did further into development. You can see him as sort of looking like a mage, maybe. I think this enemy was sort of meant to be like a Forerunner mage, so he has all these abilities that he can use. He doesn't really use sort of like hand-to-hand combat. In this concept art here, you can see him with a light rifle, but maybe he wasn't meant to use it that much and was meant to stick with his staff or his polearm and sort of cast abilities from that. That could have really made the gameplay diverse, and it would have been really interesting to see a sort of spellcaster for the Forerunners. Next up, we have the Forerunner socket system. Now, it says that this is a vehicle, but I don't think that this is actually a vehicle specifically, more attachments for a vehicle. As you can see down the side, you have those three cores: weapon, ability, and deployer core. Now, what I think this was a way to vary Forerunner vehicles by attaching these certain cores to them. So, for example, you attach the weapon core, and it turns the vehicle into an offensive vehicle. You add the ability core, and it turns it into a defensive vehicle, as you can see from the shields. You add a deployer core, and it allows it to spawn Promethians on the battlefield through sort of Forerunner drop pods. Now, this would have worked kind of like a transport vehicle, I'd imagine, and this overall would have been a pretty great way to vary vehicles, and I honestly do hope this returns in the future. Next up, we have concepts for 2 or 3 Promethium weapons that were obviously cut from the game. Now, one thing that's very interesting to note about all of these weapons is that they utilize this socket approach that all these vehicles have done that we've seen so far. This is obviously something that 343 were trying to implement, and that they focused a lot of attention around, but it obviously never paid off correctly or in a way that they'd like to see in the game. So maybe we'll get it in the future sometime. But one of the most interesting things about this is a Promethean melee weapon. It looks sort of like a war club, or one of those like tribal Indian war clubs that you'd see. It looks really cool, and like the rest of the weapons, it utilizes the socket, the core socket. All the weapons, like I said, do utilize this core thing as well. Maybe the core was there to sort of provide the weapon with energy, and it was going to be the ammunition for the weapon. Or maybe, as you can see in this core clutch at the top of the screen here, it was actually going to fire the core itself. Maybe the core would have been like a sort of little bomb, and this little pistol thing here would have been like a Forerunner version of Halo 4 sticky detonator. When you're killing the Warden Eternal, a little bit of plating opens up on his back to reveal an orange sphere much like this core that acts as his weak point. Maybe this core was the core that we were going to see in weapons and melee weapons that never really got into weapons, so they just put it in Warden to add as a weak spot. I don't know, I'm just really grasping at straws here, but I guess that's all we can really do with this concept art. And finally, we have designs for what I can only assume was a boss that was either going to be bigger than the Warden or was going to be a probably early concept for a Guardian. Now, the thing that really intrigues me about this is that it looks like it started off as a sort of grounded thing with 4 legs and a big body, and then it moved into more of like a sky serpent, snake, scorpion type thing. You've got this almost frightening picture of one approaching Chief and staring him down, which looks really interesting to fight, and I'm not too sure how you'd fight it, whether you'd fight it on foot or in air vehicles, or maybe even if like the Infinity fought it because it was so big, but it looks like a really cool design for something that I really hope we see in the future. It has a face, so it may have actually spoken. From these different concepts for the face, you can see that its helmet almost opens up as if it were to speak to you, and from that concept of it staring at Chief, it almost looks as if it's trying to talk to him. It also has a stinger on the end of its tail, and it just overall looks like a really cool serpenty design that I would love to see in the future. No idea what it was actually meant to be, but it would definitely be awesome to fight in the future. And that's all the Forerunner concept art that we had in this drop. Let me know in the comments what you think any of the purposes of these things would have been. The War Sphinx in particular, I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on that and what it would have done in the campaign, how it would have affected the story, etc., and how it may even affect the story in the future. Thanks a lot for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video.